The huge department store was buzzing with noise. It was a Saturday afternoon, which meant the building was packed with people. Shoppers were walking in every direction, some looking at clothes, others testing out sofas, and many just trying to get through the crowd without bumping into anyone. The air inside smelled like a mix of strong perfume, new plastic, and the faint scent of coffee from the cafe in the corner. It was the kind of place that was usually too loud to think, but for one young woman, the chaos was exactly what she needed that day. Ilara was not there to buy anything. In fact, she didn't even have a shopping basket in her hands. She was dressed simply, wearing a large, oversized gray sweater that looked a bit too big for her frame and comfortable jeans that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she kept her head down as she walked. She moved through the aisles like a ghost, unnoticed by the busy salespeople and the arguing customers. She just wanted to be out of her small apartment and around people, without actually having to talk to anyone. After wandering past the kitchen appliances and the bedding section, Ilara found herself in the furniture department. This area was slightly quieter, tucked away at the back of the store. And there, sitting in the middle of a display of fake living rooms, stood a grand piano. It wasn't a brand new, shiny instrument. It was a bit old, with a few scratches on the legs and a finish that had lost its shine over the years. To the store, it was just a piece of furniture, something to make the room look fancy. But to Ilara, it was like seeing an old friend. She walked slowly toward it. Her fingers twitched lightly at her sides, a nervous habit she had whenever she was near a keyboard. She knew she shouldn't touch it. It was a store display, and usually there were signs saying, "Please do not touch." But today the area was empty. The sales staff were all busy at the front of the store dealing with a rush of customers. Ilara looked around left and right, and saw that no one was watching her. She reached out her hand and let her fingers rest gently on the cold white keys. She didn't press them down yet. She just wanted to feel the cool surface. It had been a long time since she had played a real piano. Life had gotten expensive and busy, and she had to sell her own keyboard years ago to pay rent. Standing there, looking at this neglected instrument in the middle of a noisy store, she felt a deep ache in her chest. She missed the music more than she liked to admit. While Ilara was standing there, lost in her own memories, a man in a blue suit came rushing around the corner. He was the store manager, and he looked like he was having a terrible day. His tie was loose, his forehead was sweaty, and he was holding a clipboard that he kept checking nervously. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Ilara standing by the piano. The manager let out a long, frustrated sigh. He looked at his watch, then looked at the empty stage area near the entrance. He had a problem. The store had hired a pianist to come in and play live music for the big weekend sale. It was supposed to make the store feel classy and encourage people to stay longer and spend more money. But the pianist had called 10 minutes ago to say he was stuck in traffic and wasn't going to make it. The manager was in trouble. His boss was expecting music, and the customers were expecting a show. Now he had nothing. He looked at Ilara again. He didn't see a talented musician. He saw a young woman in cheap clothes who looked like she was killing time. But he was desperate. He needed sound. He needed anything to fill the awkward silence that was starting to settle over the furniture section. He walked over to her, his shoes squeaking loudly on the polished floor. "Excuse me," the manager said, his voice sounding rushed and impatient. "You aren't thinking of buying that, are you? It's just for display." Ilara pulled her hand back quickly, looking embarrassed. "No, sir," she said softly. "I was just looking, sorry." The manager bit his lip. He looked at his clipboard again. The silence in the store felt heavy. He made a quick decision. It was a gamble, but he was out of options. "Listen," he said, changing his tone to something that tried to be friendly but sounded stressed. "We were supposed to have a pianist here today. Live music, for the atmosphere." But the guy canceled. "I see you looking at the piano. Do you know how to play?" Ilara looked down at her sneakers. She felt shy. She didn't like being put on the spot. "I know a little bit," she mumbled. "I used to play a long time ago." "That's perfect." The manager interrupted her. He didn't care if she was a professional. He just needed noise. Look, I don't need a concert. I don't need Beethoven or Mozart. I just need some background noise so the store doesn't feel dead. Can you just sit down and play something simple? Just some chords? Maybe a nice little tune? Just keep it steady so people hear something while they shop. Ilara looked at the bench, then at the manager, then back at the keys. Her heart was beating a little faster. Something simple? She asked. Yes, simple, the manager insisted, checking his watch again. Don't worry about being perfect. Just play something soft. Keep it easy. We just need sound. He didn't realize who he was talking to. He didn't know that Ilara had spent her entire childhood in music schools. He didn't know that before she ran out of money, she was one of the most promising students in her city. He just saw a girl in a gray sweater who looked like she wouldn't cause any trouble. Ilara took a deep breath. She looked at the empty keys. She knew she could just play a simple scale. She could play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and walk away. But something stopped her. She touched the keys again, feeling the weight of them under her fingers. The manager was watching her, tapping his foot, waiting for the noise to start. Okay, Ilara said quietly. I can play. Great, the manager said, turning to walk away. Just keep it low volume. And simple. I have to go check on the registers. Thanks for the help. Ilara sat down on the bench. It was hard and uncomfortable. She smoothed her sweater and placed her feet on the pedals. The store was still loud around her. A baby was crying near the elevators, and a speaker was announcing a discount on bed sheets. But as Ilara sat there, the world around her began to fade away. She looked at the black and white keys, and suddenly she wasn't in a department store anymore. She was back in her old school, on a big stage, ready to play. The manager walked off, feeling relieved that he had solved at least one problem. He expected to hear a few clumsy notes, maybe a child's song, just enough to break the silence. He had no idea that he had just asked a master to perform, and he had no idea that simple was the last thing Ilara was planning to give him. She took another breath, straightened her posture, and rested her fingers on the starting position. She closed her eyes for a split second, heard the music in her head, and then she began to play. The store manager walked away with a lightness in his step, feeling quite clever. He thought he had solved a big problem with zero cost. As he walked back toward the customer service desk, he spotted one of his assistants stacking boxes of discount towels. He waved the young man over, looking very pleased with himself. Hey, the manager whispered, pointing a thumb back toward the furniture section. Don't worry about the music situation anymore. There's a girl back there at the piano? She said she knows how to play a little bit. I told her to just play some simple background noise. Just keep it quiet so the store doesn't feel like a library. The assistant looked skeptical, peeking around a shelf of lamps to see the young woman sitting on the bench. She looked so small and ordinary. Are you sure, sir? She doesn't look like a performer. She doesn't have to be a performer, the manager laughed, adjusting his tie. She just has to make noise. I told her to keep it easy. Don't expect anything fancy. It's just to fill the air until the rush dies down. He walked off, already forgetting about the girl, assuming he would hear a few clumsy notes or maybe a simple child's song drifting through the air. Back at the piano, Ilara sat still for a moment. She listened to the manager's footsteps fading away. His words echoed in her mind. Just keep it simple. Background noise. Don't worry about being perfect. She looked down at her hands. They were rough from years of hard work and washing dishes in restaurants to pay the bills. But underneath the roughness, the muscles remembered. They remembered the hours of practice, the scales, the arpeggios, and the intense emotion of playing pieces that were meant to change the world. She felt a small spark of frustration mixed with humor. They asked for simple because that was all they expected from someone like her. Ilara took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. She decided she would keep her promise, but only for a moment. She pressed down on the keys gently. A soft, simple melody began to play. It was a recognizable, gentle tune, the kind of music you might hear in an elevator or a waiting room. Ding, dong, ding. It was polite, quiet, and very boring, For the first minute, it was exactly what the manager wanted. The shoppers walked past her without looking twice. A mother pushing a stroller talked on her phone while passing the piano, not even pausing to listen. An elderly man looked at recliners nearby, humming to himself but ignoring the music completely. Ilara was just part of the furniture, a machine making soft sounds. She felt invisible, but as she played the simple notes, something began to happen inside her. The piano, although old and slightly out of tune, had a voice. It vibrated against her fingertips. The simple melody felt too small, like trying to fit a giant into a tiny box. Her left hand, which was playing the basic bass notes, began to itch. It wanted to move. It wanted to dance. Ilara closed her eyes for a second. She thought about the hard week she had. She thought about the bills she couldn't pay, the cold apartment, and the feeling of being invisible in a city full of millions of people. She had so much feeling inside her, and Simple wasn't going to let it out without making a big scene. She started to change the music. It wasn't sudden. It was like a tide coming in. The soft, polite melody began to grow legs. She added a small flourish here, an extra note there. The rhythm, which had been slow and steady, began to speed up just a little. The background noise started to have a heartbeat. The piano's sound became deeper. The notes were no longer just soft plinks. They began to ring out, clinging to the air. The simple tune she started with was beginning to morph. It was twisting and turning, growing layers. It was like watching a black and white drawing suddenly get filled in with bright, messy colors. Nearby, a teenager was looking at a display of smartphones. He had his headphones on, blasting loud music into his ears. Suddenly, he pulled one earbud out. He frowned. He could hear something cutting through his music. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and clear. He stopped tapping on the screen and turned his head toward the furniture section. Ilara didn't notice the teenager. She was too focused on the keys. Her body posture changed. She was no longer slouching over the keys like she was trying to hide. She sat up straighter. Her shoulders dropped, relaxing. The messy bun on top of her head felt like it was holding down a storm of energy. She stopped playing the simple tune entirely. Her hands moved into a new position. This was the moment the simple request died. Her right hand began to play a fast, complicated run of notes that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall. It was too fast for someone who played a little bit. The sound was crisp and urgent. The mood in the store shifted. The music was no longer just filling the silence. It was demanding attention. It was aggressive and beautiful all at once. The contrast was shocking. Here was a dusty, cheap department store with flickering fluorescent lights. And coming out of it was a sound that belonged in a grand concert hall. The manager was at the front desk, arguing with a customer about a refund. He stopped mid-sentence. He heard a noise that didn't fit. It wasn't the beeping of a register or the chatter of people. It was music, but it wasn't the simple background noise he expected. It was intense. It was fast. It sounded hard. He looked down the long aisle of the store, trying to see past the clothing racks. "What is that?" he muttered to himself. Ilara was lost in the flow now. She didn't care about the shoppers or the manager. She was playing a complex classical piece, one that required incredible strength and speed. Her fingers flew across the keys, hitting them with precision that shocked anyone who was close enough to see. The old piano, which had been sitting silently for months, was now singing at the top of its lungs. The vibrations shook the pictures on the wall behind it. The simple girl was gone. In her place was a force of nature. She was playing with a passion that made people stop in their tracks. The music swelled, getting louder and more intense. It was angry in some parts and incredibly sad in others. It told a story without using a single word. And the best part was that she was doing it in the most unexpected place possible. The teenager with the headphones took them off completely. He walked away from the phones, drifting toward the sound like a boat caught in a current. A woman looking at pillows paused, holding a fluffy blue pillow to her chest, listening with a confused look on her face. Why was this music so good? Why was it so complicated? Ilara hit a series of low, heavy chords with her left hand. They rumbled through the floor, vibrating up the legs of the shoppers standing nearby. The request for something simple was being blown to pieces, note by note. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was attacking it, loving it, and making it come alive. The transition was complete. The background noise had vanished, replaced by a masterpiece that was just getting started. The sound that was coming from the old instrument was no longer just music. It was a physical force. It seemed to push against the walls of the big store, demanding that everyone pay attention. The simple, quiet melody that Ilara had started with was completely gone. In its place was a roaring, complicated wave of sound that filled the air from the floor to the high ceiling. The piano, which had sat silently for months, was now screaming and singing in a way that no one thought possible. The change in the atmosphere happened fast, but it felt natural, like the sun coming out from behind a dark cloud. At first, only a few people close by noticed, but as the music grew louder and faster, the effect began to spread. It was like a ripple in a pond. People who were walking quickly toward the checkout counter slowed down. They didn't mean to stop, but their feet just stopped moving. A woman who was arguing with a cashier about a coupon paused. Her mouth was open to complain, but the words died in her throat. The music was cutting through her anger. It was impossible to be annoyed about 50 cents when something so beautiful was happening just a few aisles away. She turned her head, her eyes wide, trying to find the source of the sound. Ilara was in a world of her own. Her eyes were closed and her face looked peaceful but intense. She wasn't thinking about the shoppers, the fluorescent lights, or the scuffed floor. She was only thinking about the notes. Her hands were moving so fast that they looked like a blur. Her right hand flew up the high keys, playing a run of notes that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, while her left hand pounded out the deep, heavy bass that shook the floor. It was a difficult piece of music, the kind that professional musicians practice for years. It required strength, speed, and a delicate touch all at the same time. Ilara's fingers danced over the keys, hitting every note perfectly despite the piano being old and slightly out of tune. She was making the instrument sound like a priceless masterpiece. She poured all her hidden emotions into the music, the loneliness of her small apartment, the stress of trying to find a job, and the joy of finally being able to play again. The crowd began to grow. It started with just a few curious people standing near the furniture section, but soon people from other parts of the store were drifting over. A man holding a stack of towels stopped listening to his podcast and took his headphones off. A group of teenagers who were laughing loudly fell silent as they got closer. Even the security guard near the entrance, who usually looked bored and stared at his phone, stood up straight and walked a few steps toward the sound. There was a collective feeling of confusion and wonder among the shoppers. Everyone looked around at each other as if asking, "Do you hear this? Is this really happening here?" It felt out of place. They were in a cheap department store surrounded by plastic signs and discount bins. Yet the music sounded like it belonged in a grand theater in Europe. The contrast made it even more special. It was like finding a diamond in a pile of rocks. The manager, who had gone back to his office to do paperwork, suddenly froze. He could hear the music clearly now, even through the closed door. It wasn't the soft, boring background noise he had asked for. It was loud, intense, and overwhelmingly good. He dropped his pen on the desk and stood up quickly. He felt a knot of worry in his stomach. Had she broken the piano? Was she making a scene? He rushed out of his office and walked briskly down the main aisle. As he got closer to the furniture section, he saw the crowd. People were standing in a wide half-circle around the piano. No one was shopping. They were just staring. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Others were standing with their mouths open, completely mesmerized. The manager pushed his way gently through the back of the crowd. When he finally saw Ilara, his jaw nearly hit the floor. He saw the young woman in the oversized gray sweater, the same girl he had thought was just a random customer. She was bent over the keys, her body swaying with the rhythm. She was sweating slightly, her hair falling out of her bun, but she looked powerful. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was attacking them with passion and grace. The manager looked at his clipboard, then at the girl. He felt a strange mix of embarrassment and awe. He had asked her to play chopsticks or a simple scale. He had treated her like she was nothing special because of how she dressed and how quiet she was. And now she was giving his store a performance that money couldn't buy. He wanted to stop her, he really did, because she was distracting everyone from shopping. But he couldn't bring himself to interrupt. The music was too captivating. Ilara hit a dramatic series of chords, the sound booming through the store. The vibrations rattled the glass shelves nearby. She transitioned into a softer, more intricate section of the song. Her fingers lightly touched the keys, creating a sound like whispering wind. It was so delicate that the crowd leaned in, afraid to breathe too loudly and miss a single note. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, broke away from her mother's hand. She walked right up to the side of the piano, standing close to Ilara's knee. She watched Ilara's hands fly up and down the keyboard with big, wondering eyes. The mother tried to pull her back, whispering, "Don't bother her, honey," but the little girl wouldn't move. She was hypnotized by the movement of Ilara's hands and the magic coming from the piano. Ilara didn't notice the girl, or the manager, or the 50 people standing behind her. She was in the final, most difficult part of the piece. The music was building up again, getting faster and louder. It felt like a storm was brewing inside the piano. The tension in the room grew tighter. Everyone held their breath. They could feel the energy rising. It was as if the whole store was waiting for something big to happen. The ordinary Saturday afternoon had vanished, replaced by this extraordinary moment. Ilara's fingers moved with a speed that seemed impossible, preparing for the grand finale that would leave everyone speechless. The music inside the store had reached a level of intensity that felt almost dangerous. It was as if a storm had been trapped inside the old wooden body of the piano, and Ilara had finally opened the door to let it out. Her hands were moving so fast now that they were barely visible to the people standing in the front row. It looked like magic, like a blur of motion creating sound out of thin air. The notes were not just sounds anymore. They were punchy and sharp, hitting the air with a force that made people's chests vibrate. Every single person in the furniture section had stopped what they were doing. The crowd, which had started as just a few curious shoppers, had grown into a thick wall of people. They were standing 3 or 4 rows deep, squeezing in between the sofas and the bookshelves to get a better look. It was strange to see so many people frozen in a place that was usually full of rushing and noise. There was no talking, no crying of babies, and no beeping of cash registers. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the rest of the world, leaving only the piano to speak. On the second floor, which overlooked the main area, people were leaning over the polished metal railing. They had been looking at rugs and lamps when the sound drifted up to them. Now they were staring down at the scene below. It was a surreal sight to look down upon a sea of heads all facing the same direction, all focused on one young woman in a gray sweater. It looked like a rock concert, but without the lights and the amplifiers. It was just pure, raw talent echoing through the building. Ilara was completely unaware of the hundreds of eyes on her. She was lost in a different world. In her mind, she wasn't in a department store. She was imagining she was back on a grand stage wearing a flowing gown, playing for a crowd that loved music. But in reality, she was sweating. Her oversized sweater was starting to stick to her back, and a strand of hair had fallen loose, sticking to her forehead. Her arms were beginning to burn with the effort of playing such a difficult piece, but she didn't slow down. She used that pain to pour even more emotion into the keys. She played with a look of fierce determination, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. Biting her lip as she hit the hardest parts of the song, the manager was still standing near the back of the crowd. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his clipboard was tucked under his arm, forgotten. He was supposed to be making sure people were buying things, not just standing around. But he couldn't bring himself to break it up. A few minutes ago, a sales assistant had walked up to him and whispered, "Should we ask her to stop? She's blocking the aisle." The manager had shaken his head immediately. "No," he had said firmly. "Don't touch her. Let her play." He realized that stopping her now would be a mistake. It would be like stopping a bird in the middle of a song. He looked around at the customers' faces. He saw people who looked tired and stressed, people who had probably been dealing with their own hard days. But right now their faces were softened. They looked peaceful. They looked amazed. He saw a tall man in a business suit with his eyes closed, a small smile playing on his lips. He saw an elderly woman holding onto her cart, swaying gently to the rhythm. The manager realized that this wasn't just music. It was a gift. This girl was giving these strangers a moment of beauty in the middle of their boring, busy Saturday. The music shifted again. The fast, chaotic rain of notes slowed down just for a second, dropping into a deep, heavy rhythm. It sounded like thunder rolling in the distance. Ilara's left hand was playing low chords that were so strong you could feel them in the floorboards. It made the hair on people's arms stand up. It was the kind of sound that demands respect. Then, without warning, her right hand shot up the keyboard again, climbing higher and higher, playing notes that were so bright and clear. They sounded like bells ringing in the sky. The little girl who had been standing near Ilara's knee was still there. She wasn't moving at all. She was staring at Ilara's hands with intense focus, as if she was trying to memorize exactly how they moved. The music was sparking something in her. It was a moment of pure inspiration. The child's mother, who had been trying to pull her away moments ago, was now standing still too, watching her daughter watch the pianist. She realized that this was a moment her daughter might remember for the rest of her life. Ilara's fingers were starting to feel heavy, but she knew the end of the piece was coming. She could feel the energy in the room tightening up. It felt like the entire crowd was holding its breath, waiting to see where she would take them next. She played a series of intricate, weaving melodies that were incredibly complex. It was the kind of music that makes you wonder how a human brain can think that fast, and how human fingers can move that precisely. She was making mistakes in her head, worrying that she might slip, but her hands knew exactly what to do. They had practiced this 1,000 times in the past, and the muscle memory took over. The sound of the piano was filling every corner of the massive store. Even the staff in the back warehouse, who were stacking boxes, had stopped working. They could hear the muffled sound of the piano thumping through the walls, and they stood there amongst the cardboard boxes, listening in the dim light. The music had seeped into every crack of the building. Ilara threw her whole body into the next section. She leaned forward, her shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm. She was attacking the keys with a newfound energy. It was a passionate, almost angry sound full of fire. It resonated with the frustration that everyone feels sometimes, the frustration of being unheard, of being small, of being ordinary. But as she played, that frustration turned into something powerful. It became a triumph. The crowd could feel it. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a story of struggle and victory. People were wiping tears from their eyes without even realizing it. It was a shared human experience, connecting 100 strangers together. A teenager who had been filming with his phone lowered the device for a moment, just to listen. He realized that no camera could truly capture the feeling of standing there, feeling the air vibrate with the music. Ilara's hands were moving faster than ever now. The music was racing toward a finish line. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. It was like watching a tightrope walker reaching the end of the wire. The manager was holding his breath, his feet glued to the floor. Everyone knew it was coming. The masterpiece was building up to its final, defining moment. The noise level rose, drowning out the thoughts in everyone's heads, until there was nothing left in the world but the sound of the piano and the woman playing it. She was about to deliver the final blow, a moment of sound that would silence the room forever. She lifted her hands high, ready to bring them down for the finale. With a sudden burst of energy, Ilara brought her hands down on the keys for the final time. She struck a massive, crashing chord that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The sound was huge and resonant, filling the entire space like a thunderclap. It was the kind of sound that you feel in your chest as much as you hear with your ears. For a split second, time seemed to stop completely. The note hung in the air, vibrating against the walls, the ceiling and the floors echoing the immense talent that had just been unleashed in the most unlikely of places. Then, Ilara lifted her hands off the keyboard. She pulled them back and rested them gently in her lap. The music stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier and louder than the noise had been. It was a thick electric silence that fell over the entire store. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath for the last 5 minutes and had forgotten how to let it out. The air seemed to shimmer with the memory of the sound. The contrast between the roaring music and the sudden quiet was shocking. It left the crowd dazed, their minds trying to catch up with what their ears had just witnessed. Alara sat on the bench, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was sweating, and her hands were trembling slightly from the exertion. She stared at the keys, not looking up at the crowd. For a moment, she looked like a small, tired girl again, shrinking back into her oversized sweater. The powerful, confident musician who had been commanding the room seemed to disappear into the air along with the music. Slowly, the spell began to break. Someone in the back of the crowd let out a long, shaky breath. Then, from the second-floor balcony, a single pair of hands started clapping. It was a slow, rhythmic clap at first, but it was quickly joined by another, and then another. Within seconds, the silence was shattered by a roar of applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a loud, enthusiastic eruption of appreciation. People were whistling, cheering, and shouting, "Bravo!" The crowd surged forward slightly, everyone wanting to see the face of the person who had moved them so deeply. The little girl near the piano started clapping too, jumping up and down with excitement. Her mother was wiping a tear from her eye, looking at Alara with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. The business executive in the suit was nodding his head slowly, a look of deep respect on his face. It didn't matter that they didn't know her name. For those few minutes she had connected them all. The manager, who was standing near the back, felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the shoppers, saw their happy faces and their tears, and he felt a sharp pang of guilt. He realized how wrong he had been. He had looked at this young woman and seen nothing special. He had judged her by her clothes and her quiet demeanor. He had asked her to play something simple, treating her like a tool to fill the silence, completely unaware of the masterpiece she was carrying inside her. He felt small in comparison to the greatness he had just witnessed. He pushed his way through the clapping crowd, his heart pounding. He needed to talk to her. He needed to apologize. He wanted to tell her that she was amazing, that she could have a job right there and then if she wanted it. He wanted to shake her hand and thank her for saving his afternoon in a way he never expected. He got within a few feet of the piano, opening his mouth to speak, but he was too late. Alara had already made her move. While the crowd was cheering and the manager was fighting his way through, she stood up from the bench. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She didn't look for approval or wait for compliments. She reached down and gently closed the piano lid, covering the keys that had just created such magic. It was a quiet, final motion that said she was done. She picked up her small bag from the floor and slung it over her shoulder. She ran a hand through her messy hair, tucking it behind her ear. Then she turned and began to walk away. She moved through the crowd that had gathered around her. People tried to stop her, patting her on the shoulder and saying, "That was beautiful." "And who are you?" But she just kept her head down, offering a shy, small smile to anyone who caught her eye. She moved like a shadow, slipping through the gaps between people. Before they could block her path, the manager finally broke through the circle of people. "Wait," he called out, his voice sounding strained. "Miss, please wait a second." But Alara didn't stop. She had already given what she wanted to give. She didn't want a job offer, and she didn't want an apology. She had just needed to play, to let the music out so she could breathe again. She walked quickly toward the escalators, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. The crowd parted for her, watching her go with a sense of awe, as if they were watching a celebrity leaving a red carpet dot. By the time the manager reached the spot where she had been standing, she was already stepping onto the moving escalator. She was moving away from the piano, away from the applause, and back toward her normal life. From the bottom floor, he watched her get smaller and smaller as she ascended to the next level. He stood there for a long time, looking at the empty piano bench and the closed lid. Slowly, the store began to return to normal. The applause died down, and people drifted back to the shopping carts they had abandoned. They picked up their phones and continued walking, but the atmosphere was different now. People were talking to each other, smiling, discussing the music they had just heard. The cold, impersonal feeling of the big box store had been warmed up by a human connection that no one expected. The manager walked over to the piano. He ran his hand along the smooth wood of the lid. He realized that he would probably never see that girl again. He didn't know her name and he didn't know where she came from, but he knew that he would never look at people the same way again. He had asked for something simple to fill the silence, and he had been given a masterpiece that filled his heart. As the chatter of the store returned to its normal volume, he stood by the silent piano, listening to the echo of the music that was still ringing in his ears. Grateful for the moment a stranger had shared with them all,